The Good Doctor, written by Dave Newell, narrated by Richard Hensel. Maybe he's dead now. I don't know. He seemed old, and he might have been, but I was 5 when I met him. William S. Kahn, M.D., was my doctor for a time. I don't remember when I last saw him. He just simply paled away into a fold of my memory, an indistinct place where childhood friends and well-intended promises reside. I imagine, though, I last saw him in the late 70s, when I was 6 or 7, too young to know much about him or pause to question his absurdity. I wouldn't be writing this if it hadn't been for a phone call from my mother. She's a Southern woman, and as such is a member of a mysterious network connected only by the phone. Information for us was only a call away, and for some reason that wasn't given to me, my mother asked her network about William S. Kahn, M.D. That is the power of this network. No one is ever forgotten, no matter how far removed they may be. I didn't ask about Dr. Kahn, but I was told anyway. His office could be found in a small business park off a deteriorating highway, opposite the hospital where I was born. It was the type of highway that was home to businesses that only stayed open because of the regulars and not curious travelers. It was a highway to follow, not one to explore. Somehow my family ended up at that business park, perhaps by recommendation. The office wasn't but a short drive from our house, and I remember every pothole along the way. When I think of his name, the first thing I remember are 2 concrete lions that sat atop white columns at the entrance of the parking lot, an unmarked swath of asphalt that was just as cracked as the roads that led to it. Those lions weren't guarding anything more than a broken brick building and a lonely doctor. I didn't know he was lonely at the time, of course. He was nice to me in his own way, calm mostly. My mother would tell him what was going on with me, and he'd sit at his desk and write everything in his journal. I remember his surroundings, the chairs, the pictures, the Dr. Seuss books in the waiting room. But I don't remember him, what he looked like. I think he might have been tall, and he always reminded me of a mad scientist from cartoons, but I don't recall his face, except for large, square glasses. That I don't recall his face is what troubles me. He passes easily through my memory with little identity, no way for me to know who he really is. However, I have learned that his name wasn't William S. Kahn, M.D. Word is that he'd stolen the identity of a deceased colleague in another state and forged what documents he needed to continue the dead man's life. He must have had help with the forgery, because he was notorious for having incredibly poor handwriting, even by a physician's standards, because of hand tremors. We still got our prescriptions, though. He'd scratch out his name on his prescription pad, and we'd get it filled, no questions asked. There's some disagreement on what his actual name was before it unofficially became Kahn. One person said it was Kyle Howell, but most others agree he was once called Douglas Howard, and that he was at one time wanted for murder. Opinion is divided only slightly on his name, but virtually no one agrees on his alleged criminal past. He killed the postman. No, he stabbed a store clerk. I heard it was his own mother. Someone told me it was in self-defense. A friend who knows someone says he shot a man over a woman they was both seeing. Whatever the case was, Douglas Howard never went to court, and for all I can tell, he was never arrested. It's easy for me to say that this is all just the gossip of Southern biddies and their landlines, but I must admit, after having done some research, their conversations contained some truth. When I was first told of the rumor, I started to ask around. I couldn't find much about Douglas Howard before 1955, except for a marriage license application with one Rebecca Claire Minnison. Along with that, I have seen some information on 2 medical practices he was involved with in the early 1950s, one of which he owned for a short time in a small Carolina town called Hill. The curious thing is that I can't find any record that he ever went to medical school or even had experience as a combat medic in the Second World War. In fact, he had no service record at a time when many American men his age did. I wasn't finding much until I inquired about him at the Hill Savings and Loan Bank, where he'd acquired a loan to begin his own practice out of an old house just off Main Street. None of the employees from that time were still working, and most were deceased. However, the daughter of Mr. Easton Hill, the bank's founder, was very helpful in giving me what information she knew. Her father had given Douglas Howard a $6,000 loan in 1951, but he defaulted on it and left town quietly. She remembers the day he left, as it happened on a particularly exciting day among the social crowd. On that day, an unlikely romance ended on Main Street in an explosion of glass that some of the elderly women still talk about. What happened immediately after he left isn't certain, but within a year he'd made contact with a Methodist minister who was a friend with the minister in Hill. This minister, Reverend Samuel Pike, knew Douglas because he showed up each day to Reverend Pike's shelter for the homeless to get a meal and also talk philosophy. Curious as to why such an educated man was at such a desperate place, Pike followed him one day to see what the doctor did with his time. Douglas didn't do more than bum stale bread from a bakery and feed birds at the park. I'd noticed when I was a patient of his that he kept oil paintings of birds in his office and an empty cage on the wall behind his desk. I told this to Mr. Hill's daughter, but she didn't think much of it. Apparently, Douglas Howard had a penchant for disappearing because in the summer of 1956, Reverend Pike saw him for the last time. Douglas came to him at night with blood on his sleeves and on the knees of his pants. He was asking if the Reverend knew of another place he could go. Pike tried to find out what had happened, but the doctor suddenly left the conversation and never appeared again. The next morning, 2 girls on their way to school found a homeless man dead, his chest cavity open and his belongings stolen. The police questioned Pike later that day, as they always did in crimes involving the homeless. He told them he knew nothing about the dead man. That's where the story of Douglas Howard ends, as I know it. I only experienced the later years of the career of William S. Kahn, M.D. I'm told that not long after my family left his practice, his forgery was found out, but he once again had managed to leave as easily as he'd arrived. I don't argue that the rumors have foundation, but I still find room for denial. The first memory I have related to doctor's visits is a day I got shots. For what, I don't know. He came into the room with a deep wooden tray that in its construction reminded me of my grandfather's tackle box. The tray was full of small glass bottles and a thick roll of colorful bandages and stickers. Dr. Kahn gave me a shot, patted me on the shoulder, and began to apply a small yellow bandage to my arm. As he did this, he remarked at how impressed he was I hadn't cried or even winced. For many years as a child, I had teachers and classmates tell me I was small and weak, but I knew Dr. Kahn thought differently. So how could he have killed someone? It's easy to deny the thought when thinking of the same man I'd trusted, despite his unsteady hands, to safely press a needle into my arm. He'd managed, though, and despite my mother's belief that he's the reason for my brother's childhood asthma, I'll always think of the day he gave me shots. His hands and everything about him were steady. He was a good doctor. The Good Doctor is both an introduction to and a partial continuation of the novel Red Lory and the Life of Douglas Howard. Start a trial at audible.com and download the Red Lory audiobook narrated by Richard Hensel for free. Red Lory is also available as an ebook and in paperback and may be purchased from amazon.com or davenewell.net.